Hello again, this is Dr. Reginald Yawnsworth, and tonight we're reluctantly examining one of history's most peculiar love stories, the tragic tale of Emperor Nero and his beloved Sporus. A story of imperial madness, desperate love, and the lengths to which absolute power will go to deny the finality of death. We're traveling to 1st century Rome, to marble palaces echoing with the sound of lyres and the whispers of courtiers, where the most powerful man in the world would attempt to resurrect his dead wife by transforming a beautiful boy into her living image. So settle in, perhaps adjust those pillows, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Are you in Rome, walking streets where Nero's golden house once sprawled across the hills? Or perhaps in Greece, where ancient theatres still remember his voice raised in song? Wherever you are, dim those lights and let's drift back nearly 2,000 years to a time when madness wore a crown and love took forms that would scandalize even our modern sensibilities. Tonight's story isn't just about romance, though there's certainly that. It's about power corrupting absolutely, about grief that refuses to accept reality, and about a young man caught in the web of imperial obsession. It's about an emperor who fancied himself an artist, a woman whose beauty became her doom, and a boy whose resemblance to the dead would shape the rest of his short life. It's about how empires crumble, not always through external conquest, but sometimes through the internal rot of unchecked desire and unhinged authority. Chapter 1. The Artist Emperor. In the year 37, CE, as the Roman Empire stretched from Britain to the Euphrates and Mediterranean trade routes, carried silk from China and spices from India, a child was born into the most powerful family in the world. His name was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, though history would remember him as Nero, Claudius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, the 5th emperor of Rome, and perhaps the most notorious ruler who ever lived. But let's dispel some myths from the start. The Nero of popular imagination, the mad emperor who fiddled while Rome burned and fed Christians to lions for entertainment, is largely a creation of later Christian historians who had every reason to blacken his memory. The real Nero was more complex, a man of genuine artistic ambition trapped in a role that demanded military prowess and political cunning he never possessed. Nero was raised in a world of luxury that would have impressed even modern billionaires. The imperial palaces of Rome contained gardens that recreated entire landscapes, dining rooms with ivory ceilings that could rain flower petals on guests, and private theatres where the world's finest performers competed for imperial favour. It was a life where every desire could be fulfilled with a word, where the distinction between fantasy and reality became dangerously blurred. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was one of the most ambitious women in Roman history. She had maneuvered her way into marriage with Emperor Claudius, then allegedly poisoned him to place her teenage son on the throne. Nero became emperor at 16, nominally the most powerful person on earth, but actually controlled by advisors and his domineering mother. From the beginning, Nero showed more interest in poetry and music than in governance. He spent hours practicing the lyre, composed verses that he inflicted on captive audiences, and dreamed of performing on stage like a common actor, something that horrified the Roman aristocracy. Emperors were supposed to conquer barbarians and expand the empire, not prance about in theatrical costumes. The early years of Nero's reign were actually quite successful, largely because he left most governing to capable advisors like Seneca, the philosopher, and Burrus, the Praetorian prefect. Rome prospered, the frontiers were secure, and the emperor seemed content to play at being an artist, while others handled the tedious business of running an empire. But absolute power has a way of corrupting even artistic souls. As Nero grew older and more confident, he began to chafe at any constraints on his authority. He had his mother murdered in 59 CE, drowning her in a collapsible boat of his own devising when poison and falling ceilings failed to do the job. He divorced and executed his first wife, Octavia, daughter of the previous emperor. He was becoming the monster that unlimited power almost inevitably creates. Yet, even as he grew more tyrannical, Nero retained his passion for performance. He appeared on stage in theatres across the empire, competing in chariot races and musical competitions, where his victory was always assured by terrified judges. Roman aristocrats watched in horror as their emperor made a spectacle of himself, but they dared not voice their disapproval openly. It was into this world of imperial madness and artistic pretension that Poppaea Sabina entered in the late 50s CE. She was beautiful, intelligent, and ambitious. Exactly the kind of woman who could capture the attention of an emperor who confused love with possession and art with reality. Chapter 2. The Golden Empress. Sabina was everything that Roman moralists claimed to despise in women, yet everything that Roman men secretly desired. Born into the aristocracy around 30 CE, she possessed the kind of beauty that launched ships and toppled kingdoms, golden hair that caught sunlight like spun metal, skin so perfect that poets struggled to find adequate comparisons, and eyes that ancient sources describe as simultaneously innocent and knowing. But Poppaea was far more than just a beautiful face. She was educated, witty, and possessed of the kind of ambition that could only flourish in the hothouse atmosphere of imperial Rome. She understood that beauty was a political weapon and wielded it with the skill of a master strategist. Where other women might have been content to be ornaments in some senator's house, Poppaea aimed for the very pinnacle of power. When she first caught Nero's attention, she was already married to Otho, one of the emperor's close friends and future emperor himself. This didn't deter Nero in the slightest. Emperors took what they wanted, and what Nero wanted was Poppaea. He sent Otho to govern a distant province, effectively exiling him so that the coast would be clear for imperial seduction. Poppaea proved to be more than just another conquest. Unlike the cowed courtiers who surrounded Nero, she was unafraid to challenge him intellectually and emotionally. She shared his love of luxury and spectacle while possessing the political acumen he lacked. Ancient sources suggest that she was one of the few people who could influence Nero's decisions, and she used that influence to advance her own position and that of her family. Their relationship scandalized even Roman society, which was hardly prudish by modern standards. Nero was still married to Octavia, Claudius's daughter, and imperial marriages were political arrangements that couldn't be dissolved lightly. But Poppaea was patient and determined. She understood that becoming Nero's mistress was only the first step toward her ultimate goal, becoming Empress of Rome. The couple's life together was a whirlwind of luxury and excess that would have impressed even modern celebrities. They traveled in golden litters attended by hundreds of servants. Poppaea's daily beauty routine allegedly required the milk of 500 donkeys, and her shoes were made of solid gold. When she appeared in public, the very air was perfumed with rare oils and exotic incenses. But beneath the luxury lay genuine affection. Ancient historians, hostile though they were to both Nero and Poppaea, acknowledged that their relationship seemed to involve real love, alongside political calculation. Nero wrote poetry about Poppaea's beauty and composed songs that he performed in her honor. She, in turn, encouraged his artistic pursuits and created a court atmosphere where Greek culture and Eastern luxury could flourish. In 62 CE, Nero finally divorced Octavia and married Poppaea in a ceremony of unprecedented magnificence. She became Augusta, Empress of Rome, the most powerful woman in the world. For a brief moment, it seemed like their love story might have a happy ending. They had wealth, power, and each other. What more could they possibly want? The answer came in 63 CE with the birth of their daughter, Claudia Augusta. Nero was reportedly overjoyed, seeing in his child the continuation of his dynasty and proof of the gods' favor. He had the Senate declare the infant a goddess and planned elaborate celebrations to mark her birth. For a few months, the imperial family seemed complete and happy. But the gods, as ancient Romans believed, are jealous of mortal happiness. Claudia Augusta died when she was only 4 months old, plunging both parents into grief that would reshape their relationship and, ultimately, the empire itself. Nero, who had never learned to cope with any form of loss or denial, was devastated, but his grief was nothing compared to what was coming. In 65 CE, Poppaea died under circumstances that remain mysterious to this day. Ancient sources claim that Nero kicked her to death in a fit of rage while she was pregnant with their second child. Others suggest she died in childbirth or from complications of pregnancy. What's certain is that Nero's reaction to her death was immediate and extreme. The emperor, who had ordered the deaths of his mother, his wife, and countless others, was utterly undone by the loss of the woman he genuinely loved. Chapter 3. The Madness of Grief. Poppaea's death in 65 CE transformed Nero from a self-indulgent but relatively manageable autocrat into something approaching clinical madness. The emperor, who had once found pleasure in poetry and performance, now seemed lost in a world of grief that no amount of power could remedy. The funeral he arranged for Poppaea was the most elaborate in Roman history. Her body was not cremated according to Roman custom, but embalmed in the Egyptian manner and placed in a tomb that rivaled the pyramids in its magnificence. Nero personally delivered the eulogy, breaking down in tears as he praised her beauty, intelligence, and devotion. The entire empire was ordered into mourning, and anyone who failed to display appropriate grief risked imperial displeasure. But the funeral was only the beginning. Nero had Poppaea declared a goddess, building temples in her honor and establishing a cult with priests and sacred rituals. He commissioned countless statues and paintings of her, filling his palaces with images of the dead empress. Visitors to the imperial court found themselves surrounded by artistic representations of Poppaea, as if Nero was trying to resurrect her through sheer artistic will. The emperor's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would spend hours talking to Poppaea's statues, addressing them as if she was still alive. He ordered that her rooms be maintained exactly as she had left them, with servants continuing to bring fresh flowers and prepare daily baths for a woman who would never return. Courtiers learned to speak of the empress in the present tense, pretending that she was merely away traveling rather than lying in her elaborate tomb. Nero's grief also took more destructive forms. He became suspicious of anyone who had ever criticized Poppaea or seemed insufficiently devastated by her death. Several senators and courtiers found themselves facing treason charges for failing to display adequate mourning. The emperor, who had once been content to leave governance to others, now involved himself in every detail of administration, but only to ensure that his wife's memory was properly honored. The empire, meanwhile, began to show signs of strain. Nero's artistic pretensions and lavish spending had always been expensive, but his grief-fueled projects pushed imperial finances to the breaking point. The reconstruction of Rome after the Great Fire of 64 CE was competing with memorial projects for Poppaea, and both were draining the treasury at an alarming rate. It was during this period of imperial madness that Nero first encountered the boy who would become Sporus. Ancient sources differ on exactly when and where they met, but the most reliable accounts place their first meeting in 66 CE, about a year after Poppaea's death. Nero was traveling through Greece, participating in athletic and artistic competitions with the obsessive dedication of a man trying to outrun his grief. Sporus was probably around 14 or 15 at the time, a beautiful boy from a good family who had caught the emperor's attention at one of the many festivals and competitions that marked Nero's Greek tour. What struck Nero immediately was not just the boy's beauty, but his resemblance to Poppaea. Ancient sources describe Sporus as having the same golden hair, the same delicate features, and the same ethereal quality that had made the empress so captivating. For most people, such a resemblance would have been noteworthy but hardly life-changing. For Nero, still trapped in grief and increasingly disconnected from reality, it was a sign from the gods. Here was a chance to bring Poppaea back, not through mere artistic representation, but through living flesh. It was an idea that would have occurred only to someone with unlimited power and a complete inability to accept the finality of death. The transformation of Sporus from a freeborn Roman boy into Nero's ersatz empress began gradually. At first, Nero simply enjoyed the boy's company, perhaps finding comfort in features that reminded him of happier times. But as weeks turned to months, the emperor's plans became clearer and more disturbing. He wasn't just seeking companionship, he was attempting to perform the ultimate act of imperial will, the resurrection of the dead through the transformation of the living. Chapter 4. The Transformation. What Nero proposed to do to Sporus was unprecedented in Roman history, though perhaps not surprising given the emperor's increasingly tenuous grip on reality. He wanted to transform the beautiful boy into a living replica of Poppaea, complete with the legal and social status of an empress. It was an act of love, madness, and imperial hubris that would shock even a society accustomed to autocratic excess. The process began with Sporus's physical transformation. Nero employed the finest doctors and surgeons available to the Roman Empire, men who had studied in Alexandria and Athens and understood the most advanced medical techniques of their time. The exact nature of the procedures they performed remains somewhat mysterious, as ancient sources are understandably vague about such matters. What we do know is that Sporus underwent what would today be called gender reassignment surgery, though the techniques available in the 1st century CE were primitive and dangerous by modern standards. Ancient sources mention the use of various drugs and surgical procedures to alter his physical appearance and vocal characteristics. The process was apparently successful enough that contemporary observers describe the transformed Sporus as remarkably feminine in appearance. But the physical transformation was only part of Nero's grand design. He also set about erasing Sporus's previous identity and creating a new legal and social persona. The boy's original name was abandoned, and he was given the name Sporus, derived from the Greek word for seed or sowing, perhaps a reference to Nero's hope that this union might somehow bear fruit. Sporus was dressed in the finest silk and gold, adorned with jewelry that had once belonged to Poppaea herself. His hair was styled in the elaborate arrangements favored by Roman empresses, and he was taught to walk, speak, and carry himself with the dignity expected of imperial consorts. The transformation was so complete that visitors to the court who hadn't known Sporus before his change might have believed they were meeting a woman of noble birth. The legal aspects of the arrangement were equally extraordinary. Nero went through the formalities of a marriage ceremony with Sporus, complete with traditional vows, rings, and public celebration. From a legal standpoint, it was meaningless. Roman law didn't recognize same-sex marriages, and Sporus's original male identity couldn't be completely erased. But Nero was emperor, and his will was effectively law. If he declared Sporus to be his wife and empress, then that's what Sporus would be, regardless of legal precedent or social convention. The wedding ceremony itself was a bizarre spectacle that combined traditional Roman elements with Nero's theatrical sensibilities. Sporus appeared in a bridal veil and traditional women's clothing, while Nero played the role of the groom with apparent sincerity. The ceremony was attended by the full imperial court, and no one dared to voice objections or even surprise. In Nero's Rome, the emperor's whims were treated as natural law, no matter how unnatural they might seem. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire arrangement was psychological rather than physical or legal. Nero genuinely seemed to believe that he had somehow brought Poppaea back from the dead. He addressed Sporus by the empress's name, expected him to respond to her memories and experiences, and became angry when the boy failed to display knowledge or characteristics that only the real Poppaea could have possessed. Sporus, meanwhile, found himself trapped in a role that required him to deny his own identity and pretend to be someone he had never known. Ancient sources suggest that he played the part with remarkable skill, perhaps understanding that his survival depended on maintaining Nero's delusion. He learned to respond to Poppaea's name, to display appropriate knowledge of court gossip and imperial history, and to satisfy Nero's emotional and physical needs. The imperial court adapted to this new reality with the flexibility that characterized life around autocrats throughout history. Courtiers learned to address Sporus as Empress Poppaea, to treat him with the respect due to an imperial consort, and to pretend that the entire situation was perfectly normal. Some may have been genuinely confused or disturbed by the arrangement, but no one with any sense of self-preservation dared to express such feelings openly. Chapter 5. The Imperial Charade. Life in Nero's court after Sporus's transformation became an elaborate theatrical performance in which everyone was required to participate, though only the emperor seemed to believe in the reality of the play. Sporus, now addressed as Empress Poppaea by everyone from senators to slaves, found himself living in a bizarre world where his very identity had been legally and socially rewritten by imperial decree. The daily routine of the transformed court was both luxurious and surreal. Sporus was given all the privileges and responsibilities of an empress. He attended state functions, received foreign ambassadors, and participated in religious ceremonies with the solemnity expected of Roman royalty. Ancient sources describe him as remarkably poised in these situations, suggesting either extraordinary adaptability or careful coaching in imperial protocol. Nero, for his part, seemed genuinely happy for the first time since Poppaea's death. He would spend hours with Sporus, reminiscing about events that had occurred before the boy's transformation, expecting responses and reactions that only the real Poppaea could have provided. When Sporus failed to remember some detail or reacted inappropriately, Nero would fly into rages that terrified the entire court. The emperor's delusion was so complete that he commissioned new portraits and statues showing himself with Sporus, whom he insisted on identifying as Poppaea in all official artwork. These images created a strange visual record of imperial madness, classical Roman art depicting what appeared to be a traditional imperial couple, but which knowledgeable viewers understood to represent something far more complex and disturbing. Foreign visitors to Rome found themselves caught in this web of imperial fantasy. Diplomats from Parthia, Britain, and Germania were expected to treat Sporus as a legitimate empress, while presumably understanding that they were actually negotiating with an emperor who had lost his grip on reality. Most seemed to have played along, perhaps calculating that humoring Nero's madness was preferable to provoking his anger. The Roman aristocracy, meanwhile, watched these developments with growing alarm. Bad enough that their emperor preferred singing to governing, worse that he had murdered his mother and first wife. But this transformation of a young man into an ersatz empress suggested a level of madness that threatened the stability of the empire itself. Secret communications between senators began to discuss the possibility of removing Nero from power, though no one dared to act openly. Sporus himself remains something of an enigma in the historical record. Ancient sources written by men who lived in a world where gender roles were rigidly defined and same-sex relationships were acceptable only in specific contexts struggled to categorize or understand his situation. Was he a victim of imperial caprice, a willing participant in Nero's fantasies, or something more complex? What seems clear is that Sporus played his assigned role with skill and apparent dedication. He learned to move and speak like a woman of high rank, to display appropriate knowledge of court politics and imperial history, and to satisfy Nero's emotional needs with at least the appearance of genuine affection. Whether this represented Stockholm Syndrome, pragmatic adaptation, or something approaching authentic feeling remains unknowable at this historical distance. The relationship between Nero and Sporus also had genuine moments of tenderness that complicate any simple interpretation of their arrangement. Contemporary accounts describe Nero composing poetry for Sporus, giving him elaborate gifts, and treating him with the kind of solicitude typically reserved for beloved wives or mistresses. Whatever psychological dynamics were at work, there seems to have been real affection alongside the obvious elements of coercion and fantasy. But the broader Roman world was growing increasingly unstable. Nero's artistic pretensions, extravagant spending, and now his bizarre domestic arrangements were undermining confidence in imperial authority. provincial governors began to question orders from Rome, and military commanders started making discreet preparations for potential civil war. The empire that Augustus had so carefully constructed was beginning to fracture under the weight of one man's unlimited power and unlimited madness. Chapter 6. The Greek Interlude. In 66 CE, Nero embarked on an extended tour of Greece that would consume nearly 2 years and effectively mark the beginning of the end of his reign. Ostensibly, the trip was designed to participate in the great athletic and artistic competitions that had made Greece famous throughout the ancient world. In reality, it was the ultimate expression of Nero's artistic pretensions and his growing disconnection from the practical business of governing an empire. Sporus accompanied the emperor on this extended journey, playing the role of empress in a traveling court that included thousands of servants, entertainers, and hangers-on. The logistics of moving such an enormous entourage across the Greek peninsula were staggering, requiring the resources of entire cities and the cooperation of provincial governors who must have wondered if their emperor had completely lost his mind. Nero's participation in Greek competitions was a farce that nonetheless had to be treated with deadly seriousness by everyone involved. He competed in chariot racing despite having no particular skill with horses, sang in musical competitions where his voice was adequate at best, and performed dramatic recitations that ancient sources describe as mediocre. But judges, terrified of imperial displeasure, awarded him victory after victory, creating a fiction of artistic triumph that Nero seemed to genuinely believe. The emperor's delusion extended to his relationship with Sporus during this period. Ancient sources describe elaborate ceremonies in which Nero would publicly celebrate their marriage in Greek cities, treating these events as renewal of vows with his beloved Poppaea. Local officials, caught between their desire to honor a visiting emperor and their confusion about his domestic arrangements, played along with varying degrees of success. Sporus, meanwhile, continued to adapt to his impossible situation with what appears to have been remarkable resilience. Greek sources describe him as dignified and appropriate in his public appearances, suggesting that he had mastered the complex social skills required to function as an imperial consort. Whether he found any genuine happiness in this role, or was simply an extraordinarily skilled actor, remains unclear. The extended Greek tour also provided opportunities for Nero and Sporus to live with more privacy than was possible in Rome. Away from the intense scrutiny of the imperial court, they could develop their relationship without constant observation by senators and courtiers. Some sources suggest that this period was the happiest of their time together, when the artificial elements of their arrangement could be temporarily set aside in favor of something approaching genuine companionship. But even in Greece, reality had a way of intruding on imperial fantasy. News from Rome grew increasingly alarming as provincial revolts broke out in Gaul and Britain, financial problems mounted, and conspiracies against Nero's rule multiplied. The emperor's advisors urged him to return to the capital and address these crises, but Nero seemed more interested in his next artistic competition than in the survival of his empire. The breaking point came in 68 CE with news that the Senate had declared Nero a public enemy, and that several provincial governors were marching on Rome with their legions. The emperor, who had spent 2 years playing at being an artist in Greece, suddenly found himself a fugitive from his own empire. The elaborate fantasy world he had constructed around himself and Sporus was about to collide with harsh political reality. Chapter 7. The Flight from Rome. By the spring of 68 CE, Nero's world was collapsing with the speed and inevitability of a classical tragedy. The Senate had declared him an enemy of the people, the Praetorian Guard had abandoned him, and rebel armies were converging on Rome from multiple directions. The emperor, who had spent years living in an elaborate fantasy, was suddenly forced to confront the reality that his subjects had finally had enough of his madness and misrule. The immediate catalyst for Nero's downfall was the revolt of Julius Vindex in Gaul, followed quickly by the defection of Galba in Spain. These weren't mere provincial uprisings, but coordinated attempts to replace an emperor who had lost all credibility with both the military and the civilian population. News of each fresh rebellion reached Rome like hammer blows, and even Nero's most loyal supporters began making discreet preparations to change sides. Sporus found himself in an impossible position as the empire crumbled around them. He had spent 3 years playing the role of empress in Nero's elaborate charade, but now that performance was becoming literally a matter of life and death. If Nero fell, what would happen to the boy who had been transformed into his ersatz wife? Roman history offered few examples of mercy toward the intimate associates of fallen tyrants. Nero's initial response to the crisis was characteristically theatrical. He spoke of fleeing to Egypt, where he imagined he could live as a private citizen and pursue his artistic interests without the burdens of imperial responsibility. He composed dramatic speeches about the ingratitude of the Roman people and the tragedy of unappreciated genius. But as reports arrived of advancing armies and senatorial death sentences, even Nero began to understand that his situation was desperate. The emperor's last days in Rome were spent in frantic attempts to rally support that no longer existed. He offered enormous bribes to the Praetorian Guard, promised reforms to the Senate, and even considered releasing all prisoners and slaves to create an army of the desperate. But his reputation for betrayal and his obvious panic undermined any confidence these measures might have inspired. Romans who had endured years of his misrule were not inclined to give him another chance. On June 8, 68 CE, Nero learned that the Senate had condemned him to death in the ancient manner. He would be stripped naked, beaten with rods, and then strangled. It was a death designed to humiliate as well as kill, the ultimate rejection of imperial pretensions by a body that had once groveled before his authority. Faced with this prospect, Nero finally accepted that his reign was over. The emperor's flight from Rome was as chaotic and undignified as everything else in his final period. Accompanied by only a handful of loyal servants and Sporus, he slipped out of the city under cover of darkness, heading for a suburban villa owned by his freedman Phaon. It was a pathetic end for a man who had once commanded legions and received the submission of kings. At Phaon's villa, Nero spent his last hours in a mixture of self-pity and genuine terror. Ancient sources describe him alternately weeping for his lost empire and practicing suicide speeches as if preparing for a final performance. He allegedly lamented that the world was losing such a great artist, apparently still unable to distinguish between his artistic pretensions and political reality. Sporus remained with Nero throughout this final ordeal, though ancient sources provide little detail about his thoughts or feelings during these desperate hours. Having spent years adapting to the emperor's increasingly bizarre demands, he now faced the prospect of sharing his fate. The boy who had been transformed into an empress was about to discover whether that transformation would protect him or damn him in the eyes of Nero's successors. Chapter 8. The Death of Caesar. On June 9th, 68 CE, in a modest villa outside Rome, the last of the Julio-Claudian emperors prepared to end his life rather than face capture by his enemies. Nero's final hours were spent in characteristic dramatic fashion, composing verses about his fate and rehearsing speeches that no one would ever hear. But for all his theatrical posturing, the approaching sound of horses' hooves concentrated his mind wonderfully on the reality of death. Sporus was with him to the end, along with a small group of loyal freedmen who had remained faithful when senators and generals had fled. Ancient sources describe the scene as both pathetic and oddly moving. A fallen tyrant surrounded by people who had genuine affection for him, despite understanding his faults better than anyone. Whatever Nero's crimes as emperor, he had apparently inspired real loyalty from those closest to him. The emperor's death was as undignified as his life had become. When he heard soldiers approaching the villa, he tried to stab himself with a dagger but lacked the courage to drive it home. Finally, his secretary Epaphroditus helped guide the blade, and Nero died with the words, "What an artist perishes in me," on his lips. It was a quintessentially Neronian moment, self-aggrandizing even in death, concerned more with his artistic legacy than with the empire he had ruined. For Sporus, Nero's death marked the beginning of a new and even more precarious chapter in his strange life. He was now the surviving widow of a hated tyrant, a living reminder of imperial madness that new rulers might find embarrassing or dangerous. The boy who had been transformed into an empress faced an uncertain future in a Rome that would want to forget the bizarre arrangements of the previous reign. The immediate aftermath of Nero's death was chaotic, as rival claimants fought for the imperial purple in what historians call the Year of the Four Emperors. Galba, the elderly Spanish governor who had led the revolt against Nero, arrived in Rome and was proclaimed emperor by the Senate. But his reign lasted only 7 months before he was murdered by supporters of Otho, ironically the same Otho whom Nero had exiled to make room for Poppaea. Sporus's fate during this turbulent period reveals something about both his character and his strange position in Roman society. Rather than fleeing or hiding, he apparently remained in Rome and somehow managed to attach himself to Otho's court. This was a remarkable achievement. Otho had every reason to hate anyone associated with Nero, given that the previous emperor had stolen his wife and destroyed his early career. Yet Otho not only spared Sporus, but apparently became infatuated with him. Ancient sources suggest that the new emperor was struck by Sporus's resemblance to Poppaea, just as Nero had been. This created a bizarre situation in which the same person who had been transformed to replace the empress became a link between her memory and a new imperial lover who had actually known the original. Otho's reign was even briefer than Galba's. He held power for just 3 months before being defeated by Vitellius at the Battle of Bedriacum. Faced with certain capture and death, Otho chose suicide, leaving Sporus once again without protection in a hostile world. But once again, the young man's strange combination of beauty, adaptability, and historical significance proved to be his salvation. Vitellius, who became the third emperor of 69 CE, also spared Sporus, and apparently planned to use him in gladiatorial games as a form of public entertainment. The idea was to force the former empress to fight in the arena, humiliating both Sporus personally and the memory of the Neronian court. It would have been a cruel fate for someone who had already endured so much transformation and upheaval. But before this plan could be implemented, Vitellius himself was overthrown by Vespasian, a capable general who finally brought stability to the empire and founded the Flavian dynasty. With Vespasian's victory, the chaotic year of the 4 emperors came to an end, and Rome could begin the process of recovering from the madness of Nero's reign. Chapter 9. The Final Act. Vespasian's rise to power in December 69 C marked the end of the chaos that had followed Nero's death, but it also brought new dangers for Sporus. The new emperor was a practical soldier with little patience for the theatrical excesses of his predecessors. He represented everything that Nero had not been: competent, disciplined, and focused on effective governance rather than artistic performance. For someone like Sporus, whose very existence was a reminder of imperial madness and excess, this change in imperial style was potentially fatal. Vespasian needed to establish his legitimacy and distance himself from the failures of previous reigns. The bizarre arrangements that had characterized Nero's court were exactly the kind of thing that needed to be forgotten if Rome was to move forward. Ancient sources provide conflicting accounts of Sporus's final fate, reflecting perhaps the confusion and secrecy that surrounded his end. Some suggest that he was executed on Vespasian's orders as part of a general purge of Nero's associates. Others claim that he took his own life rather than face further humiliation or transformation at the hands of new masters. The most detailed account, preserved by later historians, suggests that Sporus was indeed planned for use in gladiatorial games, where he would have been forced to reenact scenes from mythology as a form of public entertainment and humiliation. This was a common fate for prisoners and slaves, but it would have been particularly cruel for someone who had spent years playing the role of empress. Rather than submit to this final degradation, Sporus apparently chose death. The exact circumstances remain unclear. Some sources suggest poison, others a blade. What seems certain is that by 70 CE, the young man who had been transformed into Nero's ersatz empress was dead, ending one of the strangest personal stories in Roman history. Sporus's death marked the final closure of a chapter that most Romans preferred to forget. He had been caught up in historical forces far beyond his control, transformed by imperial madness from a freeborn boy into a living symbol of autocratic excess. His fate illustrated the human cost of unlimited power and the dangers of a system that placed no constraints on imperial will. The boy's life and death also reflected the broader themes of Nero's reign and its aftermath. Just as the emperor had confused fantasy with reality, art with governance, and personal desire with public duty, so Sporus had been forced to live in a world where identity itself could be rewritten by imperial decree. Both had been victims of a system that concentrated too much power in the hands of individuals who lacked the wisdom or restraint to use it responsibly. In the broader sweep of Roman history, Sporus was a footnote, a curious detail in the story of imperial madness that would be largely forgotten as the empire moved on to more serious business under the Flavian dynasty. But his story reveals something important about the nature of power and its effects on human relationships, about the ways in which political systems can create conditions that corrupt both rulers and ruled. Chapter 10: Echoes and Shadows. In the decades following Vespasian's consolidation of power, Rome worked systematically to erase the memory of Nero's reign and the chaos that had followed it. The Flavian dynasty understood that legitimacy required not just military victory, but also cultural rehabilitation. They needed to convince Romans that the empire had returned to traditional values after a period of dangerous experimentation with Eastern decadence and imperial madness. Nero's Golden House, that monument to artistic excess and unlimited ambition, was stripped of its treasures and partially demolished. The Colosseum was built on the site of the palace's artificial lake, literally burying imperial self-indulgence beneath a structure dedicated to public entertainment. It was a powerful symbol. Where Nero had built for his private pleasure, the Flavians created something for all Romans to enjoy. But erasing Sporus from the historical record proved more challenging than demolishing buildings. His story was too strange, too memorable, and too revealing about the nature of imperial power to disappear entirely. Ancient historians, even those writing under emperors who preferred to forget the Neronian period, found themselves compelled to record the bizarre tale of the boy who had been transformed into an empress. These accounts, however, were filtered through the moral and social assumptions of their time. Roman writers struggled to categorize Sporus or understand his motivations. Was he a victim of imperial caprice who deserved sympathy? A willing participant in Nero's fantasies who shared responsibility for the emperor's crimes? Or something more complex that their cultural framework couldn't adequately explain? Most ancient sources treated Sporus as a symbol of Neronian excess rather than as a human being with his own agency and feelings. He became a cautionary tale about what happened when emperors were allowed to indulge their worst impulses without constraint. The specific details of his transformation, his thoughts and emotions, his genuine relationships with Nero and others, all of this was secondary to his symbolic value as an emblem of imperial madness. The Christian writers of later centuries found Sporus's story particularly useful for their own purposes. Here was clear evidence of pagan depravity, of what happened when societies rejected divine law in favor of human will. The transformation of a boy into an ersatz woman became proof of the moral corruption that had necessitated divine intervention in human history through the Christian message. Medieval chroniclers working from fragmentary sources and distant from Roman social realities turned Sporus into an almost mythical figure. Some accounts portrayed him as a kind of female demon who had seduced Nero into madness. Others made him a tragic victim whose suffering demonstrated the cruelty of pagan emperors. Few bothered to consider him as a real person caught in impossible circumstances. Renaissance scholars, with their renewed interest in classical texts and their more sophisticated understanding of Roman history, began to approach Sporus's story with greater nuance. They recognized that his fate illustrated broader themes about power, identity, and the relationship between rulers and ruled. But even these more thoughtful treatments struggled with the gender and sexual aspects of his story, which challenged assumptions that would persist well into the modern era. The Enlightenment brought new perspectives, but also new prejudices. Rational thinkers like Gibbon saw Sporus as evidence of imperial decadence and the decline of Roman virtue. They were less interested in understanding his individual experience than in using his story to support broader arguments about the dangers of absolute power and the importance of constitutional constraints on authority. Modern historians have approached Sporus with greater sensitivity to issues of gender, sexuality, and personal agency. Though significant gaps remain in our understanding, the ancient sources are limited and often hostile, written by people who lived in a world where gender roles were more rigidly defined and same-sex relationships were acceptable only in specific contexts. Reconstructing the inner life of someone who lived nearly 2,000 years ago and whose very existence challenged contemporary social norms remains extraordinarily difficult. What emerges from this long process of historical interpretation is a figure who was simultaneously unique and representative. Sporus was caught up in specific circumstances that could only have occurred in the particular context of Nero's reign, but his story also illustrates timeless themes about power, identity, and survival. He was a real person who suffered real consequences, but he was also a symbol that different eras have used to explore their own anxieties about authority, gender, and social change. Chapter 11. The Human Cost. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of Sporus's story is how completely it was shaped by forces beyond his control. Born into what was probably a respectable Roman family sometime around 50 CE, he should have lived a conventional life, receiving an education appropriate to his social status, perhaps pursuing a career in government or business, marrying, raising children, and dying peacefully in old age, surrounded by his descendants. Instead, an accident of genetics, the particular combination of features that made him resemble a dead empress, caught the attention of the most powerful man in the world, at a moment when that man was consumed by grief and increasingly detached from reality. Everything that followed was a consequence of this random intersection of beauty, madness, and unlimited imperial authority. The psychological impact of Sporus's transformation can only be imagined. Ancient sources provide no direct testimony from him about his thoughts or feelings, leaving modern readers to speculate about how a teenage boy coped with having his identity systematically erased and replaced with that of a dead woman he had never known. The process must have been traumatic in ways that ancient medicine and psychology were ill-equipped to understand or address, yet Sporus apparently adapted to his impossible circumstances with remarkable resilience. Multiple sources describe him as maintaining appropriate dignity in his role as ersatz empress, suggesting either extraordinary psychological flexibility or carefully developed survival skills. He learned to navigate the treacherous waters of imperial court politics while simultaneously managing the complex emotional needs of a series of powerful men who saw him as a symbol rather than a person. The relationships Sporus formed during his brief life were inevitably distorted by the circumstances of his transformation. Nero loved him not for who he was, but for who he could be made to resemble. Otho and possibly Vitellius were attracted to him for similar reasons, his connection to Poppaea's memory rather than his own qualities. Even his friendships with servants and courtiers must have been complicated by his unique and precarious position. The sexual aspects of Sporus's relationships raise questions that ancient sources handle with characteristic discretion. Roman attitudes towards same-sex relationships were complex and often contradictory, accepting certain forms while condemning others. Sporus's situation fell outside normal categories. He was legally male but socially female, freeborn but dependent, powerful, but vulnerable. The psychological and emotional dynamics of his intimate relationships remain largely unknowable. What seems clear is that Sporus developed genuine affection for at least some of the people in his life. Ancient sources suggest that he remained loyal to Nero even when the emperor's cause was obviously hopeless, and that he formed real bonds with other members of the imperial household. These relationships, however distorted by circumstance, appear to have provided some human warmth in an otherwise chilly world of political calculation and imperial whim. The broader Roman society's reaction to Sporus ranged from fascination to horror, often depending on political allegiances and moral assumptions. Those who supported Nero or benefited from his patronage were more likely to accept the emperor's domestic arrangements, while his enemies used Sporus as evidence of imperial corruption. But even Nero's supporters must have found the situation deeply strange, a violation of social norms that raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of power and identity. Sporus's story also reveals the particular vulnerabilities of young people in ancient societies. A 14 or 15-year-old boy had little legal protection against imperial demands, especially if his family lacked the political connections necessary to resist. The transformation that Nero imposed on Sporus would have been traumatic for an adult. For an adolescent still forming his sense of identity, it must have been overwhelming. The medical aspects of Sporus's transformation deserve particular attention. Ancient surgical techniques were primitive by modern standards, and any attempt to alter his physical appearance would have carried significant risks of infection, permanent injury, or death. That he survived the process and apparently maintained reasonable health throughout his ordeal speaks to both the skill of imperial physicians and his own physical resilience. Chapter 12. The Price of Empire. Sporus's fate cannot be understood apart from the broader context of imperial Rome and the particular pathologies that unlimited power created in the Julio-Claudian dynasty. From Augustus through Nero, each emperor faced the fundamental problem of how to exercise absolute authority in a system that had been designed for collective governance. The solutions they found often came at enormous human cost. The Roman Empire was built on the premise that superior force and organization could create peace and prosperity across diverse populations. This imperial project was remarkably successful in many ways. Roman law, engineering, and administration brought genuine benefits to millions of people, but the concentration of power necessary to hold such a vast system together also created opportunities for abuse that few individuals could resist. Nero represented the logical endpoint of this process. Born into unlimited privilege and raised to believe that his desires were equivalent to divine will, he never learned the constraints that shaped normal human behavior. When grief and artistic ambition combined with absolute power, the result was a reign that pushed the boundaries of imperial authority into realms that shocked even Romans accustomed to autocratic rule. Sporus became collateral damage in this collision between individual psychology and institutional power. His transformation was possible only because Nero faced no effective constraints on his behavior. Senate, courts, and social conventions all bent before imperial will, creating a world where the emperor's fantasies became other people's reality, regardless of the human cost. The boy's story also illustrates how political systems can corrupt not just rulers, but entire societies. The courtiers, doctors, and officials who participated in Sporus's transformation weren't necessarily evil people, but they were operating within a system that rewarded compliance and punished resistance. Each person who contributed to Nero's delusion was making a rational calculation about their own survival and advancement. This dynamic helps explain why Sporus's fate provoked so little contemporary resistance. Roman society had developed elaborate mechanisms for accommodating imperial eccentricity, from Augustus's mild hypochondria to Caligula's megalomaniacal fantasies. Citizens learned to treat imperial whims as natural phenomena, to be endured rather than political decisions to be questioned. The financial cost of Nero's reign, including the elaborate charade surrounding Sporus, also contributed to the empire's broader problems. The resources devoted to imperial fantasies, the ceremonies, costumes, artists, and medical procedures might have been used for infrastructure, military equipment, or other productive purposes. In a very real sense, the empire was bankrupting itself to support one man's inability to distinguish between reality and performance. But perhaps the most significant cost was psychological and cultural. The Neronian court created an atmosphere where truth and falsehood became indistinguishable, where social roles could be rewritten by imperial decree, and where survival required the kind of moral flexibility that undermined genuine human relationships. Sporus's transformation was both a symptom and a cause of this broader corruption. The aftermath of Nero's reign saw attempts to restore what Romans considered normal social order, but some damage proved permanent. The precedent of imperial power extending into the most intimate aspects of human identity would influence later emperors, though few would push the boundaries as far as Nero had done. The very possibility of such transformation became part of the imperial toolkit, a reminder of what absolute power could achieve. Sporus's story thus serves as a lens through which to examine the broader costs of the imperial system. His individual suffering was tragic, but it was also representative of what happened when political arrangements concentrated too much authority in the hands of individuals who lacked the wisdom or restraint to use it responsibly. The empire survived Nero's madness, but only at the cost of normalizing forms of violence and coercion that would have been unthinkable under the Old Republic. Epilogue: The Sleep of Memory. And so we come to the end of our strange tale, this story of an emperor who confused love with power and a boy who paid the ultimate price for resembling a dead empress. It's a story that reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature, political systems, and the ways in which individual pathology can become collective tragedy when unchecked by institutional constraints. Sporus disappeared from history as completely as he had been transformed within it. No monuments mark his grave, no poets celebrated his memory, no artists created lasting works in his honor. He became, in the end, what Nero had tried to make him: a shadow of someone else, a reflection of other people's desires and delusions rather than a person in his own right. But perhaps there's something appropriate about this final erasure. Sporus had spent his brief adult life being forced to deny his own identity and pretend to be someone he wasn't. Death, at least, offered him the possibility of being himself again, free from the elaborate charade that imperial madness had imposed upon him. The Roman Empire outlasted Nero by nearly 400 years in the West and over 1,000 in the East. Future emperors would learn from his failures, developing more sophisticated ways to exercise absolute power without provoking the kind of rebellion that had destroyed the Julio-Claudian dynasty. But they never entirely solved the fundamental problem that Sporus's story illustrates: the corruption that unlimited authority creates in both rulers and ruled. Modern readers encountering this tale might find it difficult to believe that such events actually occurred. The transformation of a freeborn Roman boy into an imperial consort seems like something from fantasy rather than history. But the ancient sources, hostile though they often were to Nero's memory, agree on the basic facts. In a world where emperors were worshipped as gods, perhaps it's not surprising that one of them would attempt the ultimate divine act, the resurrection of the dead through the transformation of the living. The story also serves as a reminder that the past was truly foreign, a place where different assumptions about power, identity, and human relationships created possibilities that seem almost incomprehensible today. Yet the underlying emotions, love, grief, ambition, fear, remain recognizably human across the centuries. Nero's desperate attempt to bring back his beloved wife through the transformation of an innocent boy speaks to universal experiences of loss and denial, even if the means he chose were unique to his particular time and circumstances. Perhaps that's why Sporus's story has survived in the historical record despite all attempts to forget it. It crystallizes something essential about the human condition: our capacity for both love and cruelty, our tendency to use others as instruments for our own emotional needs, and our willingness to believe in fantasies rather than face painful realities. These patterns repeat themselves across cultures and centuries, though rarely with such dramatic and tragic consequences. As you drift off to sleep tonight, you might spare a thought for that nameless boy who became Sporus, who was transformed into Poppaea, who died as himself at last after years of being forced to live as someone else. His story reminds us that behind every historical event, no matter how grand or notorious, lie individual human beings whose hopes and fears were much like our own. The marble halls of Imperial Rome have long since crumbled into dust, but the echo of one young man's suffering still speaks to us across the centuries, a whisper of mortality in the grand chorus of empire. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with simpler loves and gentler transformations than those that shaped the fate of Nero's most tragic victim. The same Mediterranean moon that shone on Augustus and Trajan, on Caesar and Cleopatra, on Nero and Sporus, still rises each night over the ruins of their world. Time passes, empires fall, but human stories endure. Complex, painful, beautiful, and eternally capable of teaching us something new about ourselves and the world we've inherited from the past.